just take a minute and read that, if you can, please. So that's the mood lighting for the lecture, okay? That sets the light. This is the building I would like to share with you, so I'm only going to show you one primary building today. It's the Foundation Marguerite Arp, or in Italian, Fondazione, and it's a building that houses the work of the artist Jean Arp, who is Alsatian. That area is sort of part German, part French, and his background is mixed in that way, and it comes into play in terms of who he calls himself, sometimes Hans, sometimes Jean. It's located on a 1-acre site in a residential neighborhood above the center of the city of Locarno, Switzerland. This is just some facts about the building. The name, the place, the country, quite a period of time for a 3,200 square foot building, which is really the size of a large house. And the architect, and their main office is in Zurich, and their website is quite informative. I'll show you a few images just to get you a little bit informed about the way the building looks. This is from the street view. It's a 2-story building. You can see where the main entrance is, and to one side of the project you'll see a gate which leads to a beautiful garden, and the other side of that garden is the original house that Jean Arp moved there in around 1959. And another view near the gate looking back the other way. There's a pretty significant projection over the main entrance, and there's also a projection over a large window that's in the upper level gallery, and there's one more on the other side. And I think those projections are really important to think about in terms of what architecture is or what it could be. The office was really kind. I must have sent about 10 different emails asking for specific things, and it was interesting because I was dealing with someone who wasn't an architect, and I was saying, oh, can you give me construction photos? Can you give me the roof plan? Can you give me this? So it took about a month to get the information, and after I got it all, they wrote me a note recently and said, please don't show the first floor of the building. And then I got really intrigued. And of course, I wrote them immediately back and said, oh, I have no intention of showing the first floor. I did, but basically, I guess it's an insurance thing. And I looked on the web because I thought, oh, I'll be able to find this. I couldn't find it. But I'll allow you to imagine the ground floor of the building. But I think it's important to see the extent to which you have to go to build something, maybe that in the end looks quite simple. I mean, this is a really significant amount of construction apparatus, formwork, and I found the company that made it. It's really, really rather precise stuff. To locate you a little bit, Locarno is north of Lugano. I don't know, about an hour and a half train ride. It's on a lake. It's a beautiful city. They recently had a film festival, and the train station is marked, And you can take a local train about 5 minutes and it'll get you about a minute from this Fondazione Marguerite Arp. So it's up in the hills. And last week, Marcus showed some of the people that he worked with. These were some of the different partners on the project. Most of them are local, and one in Italy for the formwork, and one in Germany for some specialty pieces. So they've been practicing for over 30 years, so they know who to work with. And this Piazza Grande is near the train station, and it sets the tone for anyone visiting Locarno, especially if you arrive by train. And it has, in a way, a very beautiful rough pebbled surface, and the floor sort of makes you as much look out as get a sense of looking down. And where do those rocks come from? They come from the river that feeds the lake. So they're sort of smooth pebbles. And at the entrance of this, as you enter this, there's a pattern on the floor. This is a poem by Joseph Albers. Easy to know that diamonds are precious, good to learn that rubies have depth, but more to see that pebbles are miraculous. And it was strange as I looked at different artists, including Jean Arp, Henry Moore, Albers, maybe others. There's this obsession with pebbles. It's really fascinating. I hope you're obsessed by something. It doesn't have to be a pebble, but they kept on talking about these pebbles. And I put in the Google search, playing with pebbles on the shore of the lake that feeds Lake Maggiore. And here's what AI told me. It's not good to pick up the pebbles because you'll ruin the ecosystem. Meanwhile, Jean Arp said what he does, he remembers going to the shore and stacking pebbles. But now it's become a thing because it shows up on the internet and people start making ridiculous piles. And they don't become artists. So you're only allowed to make a pile if you intend to become an artist. And there's maybe where some of the pebbles come from. And Henry Moore, I'll let you look at that, his thoughts on pebbles. So Jean Arp moved to Soldano in 1959, along with his second wife, Marguerite Arp Hagenbach. That's the name of the foundation. She set the foundation up. She was an art collector, and his second wife, his first wife, died in a tragic accident, so he remarried late in life. And they bought a property in Solduno called Ranco dei Fiori, which means a slope with flowers, almost a vineyard, not so much of grapes, but flowers. And the city of Locarno is sort of known for that. I'll let you look a little bit at the building as I go through a few things. They renovated the house, and that house contains foundation offices, a research library, archive with documents, and other rooms that were part of the original house, which he saw really as a house and an atelier, or a house and a studio. And for the larger, major piece of sculpture, he worked with a sculptor who had a studio in the city itself. So, you'll find artists need a lot of space. The buildings are connected by a garden area that has stone pathways that meander up the slope at the back of the site. These are two aerial views. And the newer building was completed in 2014, a 6-year period of planning, fundraising, design, and construction. That's a long time. The seed of the idea came from Arp before he passed away. He had a mind of making this kind of foundation or a place where people could come and visit and see the works of art. But it was only realized, the foundation was established in 1988, but it took until 2014 to realize it. So if you have an idea, you may have to let it percolate a little while, then come back to it, and then try to accomplish it. Now, if you're in school, you have a semester or 2 semesters to do it. But you have to realize that some things take longer than a semester. The world doesn't really go by semesters, last time I checked. They have a collection of works by Arp and his first wife, Sophie Tauber, And then when she was married, her name was hyphenated to Tauber Arp. Sometimes Jean and his wife, his first wife, would work together and collaborate on the same drawing or the same work of art, and those are called duo works. It's a pretty interesting idea. The building itself is a simple rectified 2-story cubic volume. It measures about 44 feet across. The street elevation has a depth into the site of about 38 feet and a height of about 28 feet if you measure from the street. Off the main entrance on the ground floor is a single-run stair that leads to a landing, which has a window, and then you turn to your right, and there's a door, an accordion door that's left open, and you go into the gallery. That's the building. There's a window at the head of the stair. There's a window in the gallery. 2 windows in the building and 1 primary door. So the numbers involved are pretty small. And the window faces the garden. There's a site plan. Don't mind me, I'm still learning how to use PowerPoint before they phase it out. But you see that little devil up there, that's a wild boar. And when I went there, I noticed there was some fencing, and they said, yeah, we have a little problem with wild boars. So the students quickly went into the building and we locked the door. But that's not really what they look like. And remember, that boar is not to scale. It's actually bigger. Now, this one looks even more scary. It doesn't have the horn, and I picked this photo because the white in the eye is like that. That gave me the heebie-jeebies. You know, if you come across that, that's not a good situation. You know, in Kroger's maybe, but not out there on the slopes there. And they have a problem with that, you know, because Switzerland has a fair amount of forested land, and they want to build right next to it. So who gets it? You know, it looks like the boar wins. When I went there, I noticed this drawing that was in the archive, and I took a quick photo, but it shows the plat plan. And the house is to your right, and the foundation is to the left. And they had utilities and everything that they could run from the house. And maybe they're showing us the maximum buildable area. But I thought it was interesting just to see that. It's a dense residential neighborhood. When we got there in 2022, the second time I visited, I was leading the group. We took a bus and we came down this street. And I told the students to stop because I saw what looked like smoke. And I said, I can't, you know, I read the safety guidelines. You're not supposed to lead a group of architecture students through smoke. You're supposed to go away from a fire. Little did I know, because I hadn't checked, there was a special exhibit that had just opened where this company creates these urban clouds, and they have these misting machines. And it was part of the exhibition that was there called Clouds. It goes to show you that sometimes it helps to be a little prepared, because I was really nervous. Oh, you know, you go to take a group and then you're embarrassed. We can't go, there's a fire. So that's photos of that exhibition. You can see the foundation building and you can see the clouds in the background. The company is called Nephos Swiss Fog. We ought to have that in the lobby, huh? I don't know if Jim is here. Cost a lot of money.
I'm a little nervous, Frank.
Yeah, well, this is just a slide, Jim. Don't worry. But I do have the contact information. So we got there, and there were times when it would disappear. What I found interesting is, I don't know if it's just a characteristic of any group activity. It could be a group of faculty, but you go somewhere and they look away from the thing that you took them to. We all do it. It's like, let's go see the Empire State Building, and there's you look that way, you know. But there's one student, the name is escaping me, maybe Hunter remembers, and I think he and Nathan and maybe a couple of others were the only ones actually looking at the building, because there was a long wait of maybe 10 minutes before it opened. So what are you going to do with the time you get to a building and the time it opens? Take a break. because you're young and you get tired quick. So they're all sitting down. I mean, the bus took them, 5 feet from this building, and they were exhausted. And I understand that. Because education is exhausting. So there's the window at the head of the stair. So you can imagine a single-run stair taking you to the window, and then again the projection. And a little closer to the entrance. So the ground floor has an archive, or what the Europeans like to call a depot, and it stores the works of art. And there's a mechanic room, a bathroom, and an elevator. So now you have all the information you need to break into the building. Okay? On the roof is the elevator penthouse that's sheathed in copper. So let's get to the architecture. I think the clarity and simplicity of the building is what stood out to me. It enables visitors to study and enjoy one work of art at a time. The architecture is comprised of a set and succession of a limited number of singular, countable architectural moments. One entry door, one stair, 2 windows, in which the uncountable fecundity of the art is made present. In contrast to the architecture, the works of art are more like the magical spawning blue stones, there's the pebbles again, in a story by Jorge Luis Borges called Blue Tigers. This professor goes to find these magical tigers, blue tigers. And what he finds is underground, buried, is a group of blue rocks. And he takes those rocks back to the village. And every time, and the villagers were a little taken aback, and every time he counted the pebbles, he got a larger number. Borges was sort of fascinated by notions of infinity. Books with an infinite number of pages, impossible, right? Impossible. It's a physical object. So there's the pebbles again. But the art itself doesn't seem to be countable, right? But you can count a window and a door, but the art seems to be a bit immeasurable or uncountable. So there's this notion of singularity and oneness in the building that seems, in my mind, a bit Pythagorean. And don't get thrown off. It's just a fancy word for followers of Pythagoras, who came before Plato and was quite influential, almost a mythical figure. He didn't leave any writing. But one idea that seemed to come from, let's say, the school of Pythagoras was that things have a kind of amicable concord and similitude with number. So you look at something that isn't a number, and it makes you think of numbers. Not all the time, but sometime. But he felt that number pervaded everything. And our modern eyes might overlook and underestimate the kind of magical richness of the idea of number. So in the buildings that you're working on, how many windows do you have? How many doors do you have? How many stairs? Make each of them count. And there's a curtain in that window that sort of opens and closes as the light conditions change. And this is a group from 2022. And a sketch by Sakshi, who recently graduated. And you can see how the terrain slopes up behind the building. There's the gate that you saw the other side from the street. And the sort of back of the building. A little bit as the sun goes down. The exterior walls of the building are load-bearing and constructed of 2 separate layers of 8-inch thick reinforced concrete. And then there's an airspace between the 2 layers, which has 8 inches of insulation. The concrete pours for the exterior walls were in some cases up to 5 meters in height. That's about 16.5 feet at one time in a single pour, and that reduced the number of pours and vertical joint lines that were present on the exposed faces of the building. The stout construction defends the steep slope at the back of the building, prone to falling rocks and landslides. When you look at the section, you'll note that the slabs are about 12 inches in depth, and they span the upper floor and the roof level, so there are no visible columns in the building. And then at certain points, which I couldn't find the drawings, there are elements that connect the 2 walls to increase the rigidity and stiffness of the construction. The upper floor, just imagine that stair going down to the first floor. And the large room with number 5 is the gallery. And there's a double wall, a plenum, that allows some of the services to come up through the building. So it's a very simple plan. You see the 2 windows, and you see the projection over the entrance. And a section through the entry. It may be a little small for you, but very simple straight run stair. And a section through the gallery, with the garden being to the right. I think this is an important drawing that they sent me. I added the blue dots, the dotted line. Planned section elevation is really one drawing. So when you're working on a building, you have to realize that the interrelation of these 3 views, if you could say, but they're not views, they're rational cuts, projections, are so interrelated as to be inseparable. So if you're stuck with your section, project the elevation, or you're doing the elevation, you can project down to the plan. You can start at either place. So they're reversible and totally interrelated. I wouldn't call them a system because my former colleague, Steve Thompson, said there's no such thing as system. So let's just say they're profoundly related. And if you're able to go between these, and you need to practice, if you're working on one thing, connect it to 2 others. You'll find it really adds some richness to the project. So they sent me this drawing, which I really liked. It's a wall section annotated German, English, and Italian. And on the right is architecture, right? And architecture is not a language, I don't think, last time I checked, even though we struggle and use words to try to teach it. So that's a wall section, but I'm using a language to call it architecture. And what can you see is the double wall, the spacing. So you imagine that's about 2 feet almost. And you can see this large window in the gallery. The sill of the window comes down to the floor if you are learning to read a section. And then the head of the window is up there. And there, it looks like 2 windows. The inside window actually swings into the room. And then there's a fixed panel with air around the edges, right, of glass as well. And you can see the dotted line, which is that curtain that comes down. And that's essentially the construction of the building. Reinforced concrete slabs make the span. And then there's a kind of clean detail of the parapet. If you look really closely, you'll see some of those, the top of the parapet is sloped, so when it rains, the water will drain onto the roof. You'll notice it's not perfectly level. And if you look carefully, you'll see the sill obviously has a slope to it. And then the head of the window, the concrete, you can see it's lower at the outer edge and moves up. So there are a lot of things to consider, and we'll talk about some of those things. They used these special panels for the formwork. Remember, they poured 2 walls, and they're called spariform panels, and they're made of multiple layers of Baltic birch plywood laminated together and then coated with a kind of waterproof phenolic resin that doesn't allow moisture to penetrate or stops most of it. And it produces a relatively flat and fairly precise concrete surface. I mentioned the staggering of the joints on the facade. The final finish on the exterior face of that second wall is sandblasted, and then it's sprayed with a waterproofing coating or something that stops the moisture from penetrating the surface. So they took a lot of care to make this simple building. Inside, they used what is known as alabaster plaster. I never heard of that, not gypsum, which is very strong, very quick setting, and makes a really beautiful background for hanging some of the reliefs and paintings and things that they have. Remember, this is a building that they did after, 25 years of practice. The three primary openings and the related overhangs and projections are made in that doubled thickness of the exterior walls, and I think they reveal and intensify the presence of the wall and the presence of the architecture. So there are obviously many, practical benefits about this redundancy, because you could say, why do it in 2 layers if you could do it in 1? Well, I go back to something that one of my teachers said, Kenneth Frampton. I think he would say that second layer guarantees the existence of architecture. And I think he said that about one of Louis Kahn's buildings, maybe Exeter, which seems to have this doubling. I think we tend, and I include myself, to try, for whatever reason, to eliminate redundancy and even minimize thickness in our work. But I would say that this redundancy is essential, and it has 3 dimensions. One, it's practical to have 2 layers in this case. There's a formal moment about that redundancy, and I would say an existential moment about that redundancy as well. So the question I have maybe for us is, what in our work serves to safeguard the mortality of the existence of architecture and the immortality of the essence of architecture? Right? So one is mortal and has a limited span, and the other one is more, let's say, everlasting, has a longer duration. And I think this is the program for all projects, and that's what you bring to a project, no matter what the assignment is. Now, not all assignments are this cherry of a gallery, for an artist. You may be doing a garage addition, so I understand that this isn't a typical project. These projects are sometimes called monographic museums. So these are museums that focus on the work of a single artist. Maybe not always absolutely. In this case, his wife is also in the collection. But they primarily focus on the single artist, and there is that myth of an artist that makes these things in a way, I think, stimulating for an architect. What is the myth of an artist? What is the myth of an architect? And what is the relationship of those 2 myths? We'll come back to that. If you want other examples, you can look at Cy Twombly Gallery in Houston, designed by Renzo Piano Building Workshop. And another one that some of the Riva students and faculty have visited near the Steger Center in Riva San Vitale, called the Congiunta Museum in Guernica, Switzerland, located, again, near Riva San Vitale. And that houses the work of the sculptor Hans Josephson and designed by the architect Peter Markley. So what is it about these museums that capture the imagination of an architect? To me, it's interesting to consider why it seems so compelling. It's like the dream project, right? I'm doing a gallery for a single artist. There's some momentum in there. I think what's happening is that there's an intertwining of twin mythologies and realities of an artist and an architect, and of architecture and art. Cyril Connolly once wrote something to the effect that art is made by the alone for the alone. So maybe for that moment where you're in those galleries and you're looking at those pieces of art, you become an artist for a moment. Or what did it take to make that thing? Art is not useful in a practical sense, but it mytho-poetically holds function at bay. It's like a dam. It holds function at bay and fortifies us against what I would say is the de-spiritualization of a deterministic outlook, which sometimes tricks us into justifying every decision that we make. Your life is not long enough to justify every decision that you make. You don't have the time. So sometimes you have to allow that to happen. You don't need to know the reason for everything that you do, but there is something called reason in a larger sense that is sort of overarching a lot of the things that we do. Art is a spiritual possession, and it needs to be crafted with the utmost care. John Cage, to paraphrase him, he said, art is expression of self, not self-expression. That calls into question this notion of a kind of unbridled creativity in what we do. But if it's not about the self, meaning selfhood, right? All of us, what could it possibly be about? Albers expressed it in a different way. He said to distribute material possessions is to divide them, but to distribute spiritual possessions is to multiply them. Works of art can offer moments of inward consciousness for those who make it and those that view it. A bit about the mythical difference between an artist and an architect. And don't worry, I'll show you a little more about the building, but the building started to generate a number of questions for me. It's the difference between Prometheus and Daedalus, between fire and string. So Prometheus they say that he stole fire from the gods. I don't know how he did it, I don't know where he did it, but he did it. And he gave it to us. Gave it to humanity. So the artist has this inner fire in that Promethean sense. So let's now contrast that a bit with the architect in a mythical frame. Because we know that the architect needs a slightly different set of abilities. We need a sense of craft, and we need a bit of practical wisdom to do what we do. And the activity of an architect is sometimes mutes the Promethean. It mutes art. It holds art back because we have other things to deal with that the artist may not. So I'll try to tell this story. I'm not an expert. And you'll have to try to follow it, and I can't explain the gaps in the story. So Daedalus designed a labyrinth. Maybe it was his thesis project. His teacher was named King Minos. And the king had a monster, because all kings need to have a monster, right? I mean, if you're king, you've got to be king of everything. So this character comes to Crete, Theseus. Let's call him Theseus. Theseus. He came to Crete to kill or slay the Minotaur. That's what they say in those days. You slayed it, right? And so where does Daedalus come in? He's sympathetic and evidently connected to Ariadne, who was the king's daughter, and he gave Theseus a ball of string, right? And that would help him mark his way into the labyrinth when he was trying to find the monster, and then he could find his way out. Things didn't quite work out that way. The king was pissed. I wrote enraged, but he was pissed because he's the king. So he imprisoned Daedalus and his son Icarus in the labyrinth. Man, no trial or anything. So Daedalus devised, since he was architect, he was clever, a flying machine. I'll call that scheme 2. The string didn't quite work, so he had to have scheme 2. I hope you all have scheme 2, right? To escape. The father warned Icarus, don't fly too close to the sun. And like any good son or daughter, he flew too close to the sun and didn't work out so well. He's no longer with us. But I don't know why Daedalus survived. How? how did this, I have a question, because he was on that bird, or whatever they made, and it fell, and somehow the architect just landed on a ball, on a pile of ping pong balls. I don't know what happened, right? So we're distant relatives of that survivor, Daedalus. Only a very small part of architecture belongs to art, the tomb and the monument. Everything else that fulfills a function is to be excluded from the domain of art. In other words, only a small part of architecture is Promethean. And I would add that the category of ruins also would fall under this consideration, which is really a building that's been washed of its function over time. Bergson wrote a book about laughter, and in that book he said that art is a vital rupture of the useful. That's quite profound. Huh? I don't know if an architect can survive with that, but certainly an artist could. A vital rupture of the useful. So let's think about that small part that is that vital rupture of the useful in Bergson's terms. And I think it's particularly relevant for a building to house the works of an artist. And maybe that small part is, let's say, 10% of architecture, but it's worth 90%. It's about becoming lost in the sufficiency of the material, formal, and constructive conditions in a work of architecture, while contending with an array of necessary considerations in every project. We can make a list: program, site, function, light switches, electrical outlets, environmental systems and controls, accessibility, energy efficiency, waterproofing, fire protection, building codes. So the architect has to be agile to toggle between considerations of necessity and sufficiency. There's a difference between those two things. Something may be necessary, but it might be not sufficient. So how do we protect that 10%? Well, one way we protect it is to develop a very high level of technical proficiency and acumen to safeguard that small yet powerful part of architecture that Los was talking about. I think in this respect, we're talking about kind of the artful feeling of the beautiful. I think every aspiring architect should study at least the methods and works of at least 5 artists. You should just have them in your back pocket. How do they do what they do? And it's not always easy to find out how Mark Rothko made a painting or how Art made a sculpture. But you have to do some digging because it's very interesting to see how they work, not just not the result of that work. And there are analogies, useful analogies to the methods and works of architects. Because you're searching for a method, when you're in the studio over time in 5 years, you're searching. And it's like visiting a construction site or a dance studio. You're watching someone practice, right? So we have all these construction sites on campus. You can't always get so close, but it's really worth seeing them. There's a simplified version of the wall section where you can see the gallery, the garden, and the archive, and that very thick wall. I'm not advocating that every project has to have an extreme amount of thickness, but it's actually quite useful. And this is my highly technical diagram I found, which shows that penguins make the best insulation. Right? And that was an article written by one of the consultants on the project. So if you're asked to make a wall section, just draw some penguins between that space. Especially the bottom part evidently seems to absorb a lot of cold. I don't know how they float vertically in the water. Let's think a little bit about program. There's the roof plan. I got this, I was so excited. I studied that and studied that. I know it's hard for you to see. But when you're drawing, if you just draw a rectangle, whether you're drawing a facade or a plan or anything, look at all the lines that are in that simple roof plan. In this case, the elevator gives them access to the roof. You can see that to the left. You can see the 2 roof drains to the right, not quite in the center of the entire roof. There are scuppers, there's the walls below. there's lots of information there, and including an indication of at least 8 sections that they're taking through the building. This is a simple building, and that has 8 primary sections. So I hope you have 8 sections at least. I was so excited they gave me this, and then someone showed me how to reverse the white and the black. I was really excited about that. Remember, I'm retired, so little things become very important. Yeah. Some elevations of the building, and I'm going to get back to this question of program because I think it's important to the school. So these are what I would call schematic drawings showing the basic outlines. There you can see the slope. And that back wall, my favorite, because it looks like there's nothing. Anytime you think there's nothing, look more carefully. There always has to be something. If there was nothing, we'd be in big trouble. And that's the small window at the head of the stair. I'll let you look at some nice photographs of Sakshi that she took and she sent me. I sent a note out to all the students, and 2 students replied, and Sakshi sent these beautiful, of that morning we were there with that fog, that artificial fog. So any program requires the development of physical conditions of inhabitation and affordance because we live our lives within and around architecture. That's the part that's not in the program. Inhabitation and affordance. A few years ago, Scott gave a really fine talk about affordance. For instance, a good door handle, like ones designed by Alvaro Aalto, are generous invitations to an action, right? The action of grasping and moving the door. It's an invitation. It involves a level of generosity. Architecture, I think, is somewhat aprogrammatic or disinterested with respect to program. I would call it a sufficient disinterest, but it's not in any way to be construed as a lack of concern for the needs and desires of a client or society at large. For after all, as Botha reminded us, the client chooses us. The sufficiency of architecture is based upon what architecture is in and of itself, its particularity and specificity. It's important to acknowledge this self-sufficiency does not occur in a vacuum. I'm avoiding the word autonomy because it gets way too complicated. Let's just call it self-sufficiency, or even the self-reliance of architecture. So the primary principles and orders of architecture are concretized in tectonics and atectonics, and in the particular details and conditions of walls, floors, columns, stairs, windows, doors, and beams as they come together to make a building, that overall assembly. Frampton called it the poetics of construction, or the probity of form. You can call it what you want, but I think you know what I'm getting at. And it's important to realize that no matter how good the program may be, it doesn't lead to excellent architecture. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Most programs, in my mind, stem from a fundamental analogy of house and city. And the city is a large house, and a house is a small city. Remember, these are analogies. So that's a fundamental ethical analogy that really holds everything together, all these variants, because we could list the many different building types and programs and functions. And it goes way deeper than any program or list of functions. Analogical typology gives structure to the organization of functions. Right? So we could say structure gives, typology gives structure. Function deals with organization, but something has to tie that organization together. And we call that structure. So if function is the promise of beauty, as the sculptor Horatio Greenough once wrote, then the seed of beauty must be there from the beginning. Beauty is the hope that's prior to the promise. It's easy, I think, to unintentionally neglect architectural principles and their specific physical consequences by overemphasizing the importance of program, no matter how well-intentioned. We've been primed and conditioned towards program in ways we might be unaware and with consequences we do not fully understand. Emphasis on intention can blind one to architectural possibilities and the physical consequences of the solids and hollows that make up buildings. We're in an age or a moment of heightened intentionality leading to programs that are laden with intent, and it'll be interesting to see what kind and quality of architecture might emerge. A spatial understanding, what is contained, may become more important than constructive thinking. What contains? It's my opinion that we need to thoughtfully resist that, as much as it's tempting. Right? So I'm making a distinction that Sal used to make between what is contained and what contains. The same word with a different ending. I think it's a fundamental shift that we're seeing. Some architects advocate that buildings should recede in the background in an age of the program and social intentionality. In this situation, studying and teaching architecture can be very challenging when the expression of architecture is held in check. It's like trying to play a piano with silent keys. And I also really believe that architecture is not necessarily the appropriate response to every problem or every circumstance. Sometimes a good brochure is better than a building. Let's say, I'd rather have a brochure than another visitor center, right? Can we think of ways in which architecture might give rise to new programs? That's a question I'll leave with you. Program literally means it weighs and parses out the relative importance of a set of functions, but cannot establish either the gravitas or levitas of architecture. Gravitas is gravity, levitas is humor, lightness. Right? You need both. That's the responsibility of an architect. I can't imagine a world without form. And in this sense, a program is formless, and the architect is a form giver. This is a very old-fashioned idea. But the form-giving responsibility is not to be taken lightly. The programs that we're given are somewhat circumstantial with respect to the principles of architecture. So the program is circumstantial and architecture is situational. The question becomes, how does a given circumstance relate to a constructed situation? One may find themselves in a circumstance, but the situation must be constructed in all senses of the word. But they're both put in play, the program and the principles, in any project. The relationship is not like a hand and a glove or a lock and a key. Those are sort of absolute fits. The building is always a few sizes too big or too small. The question is, how many sizes too big or too small should we make the building given the limitations of a particular project and site? The scale of a building can be guided by thinking in terms of embodiment and module. Corbusier's modular bridges measurements and proportions and is primarily animated by a notion of embodiment and human sensibility. We like to think the building has a body. You've probably heard that from your faculty, but that body needs to be soulfully embodied. It's really about analogically attuning the proportions of a building with the proportions of a human figure. A module is a unit, like a sheet of plywood or a common brick or a concrete block. The brick is sized to the mason's hand. The concrete block needs two hands to lift. Now, modularity, on the other hand, is the idealized aspect of a form or a thing. Like calling a brick a parallelepiped. It's a brick. So the brick is simultaneously material and module. It has weight and it is weightless. And we need to keep that in mind. The relationship between things that have weight and then things that might appear weightless, like ideas, right? A few thoughts about these artists, and then I'll end with some of the more images. Jean Arp and Sophie Tauber Arp were married in 1922. Their collaboration was, I think, mythical, a relationship between two Promethean but extremely gentle souls. They were emerging out of, I would say, the gentler side of the Dada movement in Zurich. They were right there in the beginning, but I think their sensibilities were quite different. I would say they had gentle souls. Their work was neither solely constructed nor solely composed, and that was a debate at the time. If you look at the work of Max Bill, it's highly constructed mathematically. They were friends with Max Bill, but they didn't see it that way. It was a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Constructing and composing. Arp's favorite phrase, or one of his favorite phrases, was arranged according to the laws of chance. That is incredibly lighthearted and ironic. If you say, "Oh, why did you do that?" And you say, "Oh, Professor Weiner, it's arranged according to the laws of chance," just like Arp. Well, that was Arp's answer, right? I think it was a lighthearted way for him to play down the intensity and seriousness of his endeavors and the working techniques and methods he devised. So he would, for instance, have pre-cut shapes of paper kept in a box, right? A box full of Arps, and he'd drop them on the ground and say, "That's pretty good," and then he'd move it a little. He was looking for better and better arrangements of these shapes. I think he was prepared to get lucky. I hope that you realize that you have to really be prepared to get lucky. It's not easy to do. So I hope you're preparing for that luck. That's what you're doing. You have 5 years to do it. Sophie Tauber Arp was initially trained as an applied artist, quite normal for the time and extremely rare today. Imagine if you all came to architecture school with training in an applied art. And then you entered the school. You would have in your pocket a set of techniques and methods and skills. I'm not sure that would be better or worse, but it's interesting that both of them had that. They would go study applied art. You didn't go to school to study fine art. So they eventually shifted their work towards fine art. There was a major retrospective of Sophie Tauber Arp recently held at the Museum of Modern Art a couple of years ago. And then prior to this, about 40 of her works were exhibited in 1981, I think, in the US. And she was part of a group as early as 1936 where her work was in MoMA. Her work was harder to characterize, and that was one reason why it didn't show up. And now there's a lot of interest in Sophie Tauber's work, even more so than Jean Arp. Her work includes architecture, furniture, costume design, dance, jewelry, interior design, weaving, and the design of marionettes. There's something abidingly architectonic to her work. These are some of the execution drawings for the concrete pours. They started, you can't read them from where you are, but they started with that back wall, and there were 4 stages that they poured these walls. It's very interesting. I was really excited to get these drawings. So they're deciding where all the form ties and everything are located. So these are the instructions to the folks doing the form work. And that's my favorite facade. It has nothing. I hope you can get interested in those parts of the project that you think have nothing. Look at the white space in your floor plans. There's a floor there. There has to be something, otherwise you fall through. If you look up, there has to be a ceiling, hopefully better than this one. This poor room needs a little bit of refresh. But these are marvelous drawings. So they spent a lot of time giving the instructions to the contractor. Entrance door, stair, accordion door leads to the gallery. I mean, that's the building. Why all this? Why am I waited so long to show you the building? There's not much there, right? There's a calder above your head as you walk in. That's kind of nice. I don't have that when I walk into my house. You know, isn't that nice to walk under a calder? It's like, my goodness. So Jean Arp and Sophie Tauber Arp, they lived in a very difficult time in the world between World War I and World War II. A lot of turmoil. She passed in 1943 before the war was ended. During this time, which was extremely difficult to live, just have a sort of normal life, right? They moved frequently to safer places, and they endured a lot of hardships. They needed to find ways to get material, paper, pens, pencils. You have everything that you need, I hope. And they remained incredibly productive and optimistic. You know, I wonder how they did that. You know, Jean Arp was known for his reliefs and sculptures. You see some of the sculptures in here. And there's one you can see to the right. Paper cutouts, basically a world of forms with a palpable sense of life. The forms of a quality of what the sculptor Henry Moore would call fruitfulness. A major exhibition of Arp's work was held at Museum of Modern Art in as early as 1958. And a lot of times he gave titles to these works, let's call them programs, after he finished them. So that's kind of interesting. Suppose you design something that's supposed to be a garage and it turns out to be a better something else. Whoops, how did the program shift like that? It's so hard to control. It's so hard to control. You probably have had that experience. That's not what I asked you to design. Well, that takes practice. So maybe the program is more useful sometimes as a post facto thing. The sculptures of Arp sometimes are sized to the hand. They're smaller. There's the window to the garden. I mean, you talk about a painting. I mean, that ain't bad. And you know, the light switches, the fire protection, the fire sprinklers, all that is very carefully placed so that the art takes the stage. So I can imagine, I've never seen that big window open. But it's beautiful, like Swiss hardware, right? Not like the windows that I have. Sculpture in the garden. That boring back wall. So exciting. The garden. That's the original house, which has been restored. And some construction photos. This is like Christmas morning when they sent me this one. Elaborate formwork. And you have to have a crane. If it's a big building, you could have one crane. If it's a little house, you could have one crane. So there you can see, you know, the first inner wall, and then the insulation, and then the outer wall, so you can see all the layers. Quite elaborate. You may not be able to see it from there, but this is woven together, so it's completely and totally constructed. So I think in some ways she was a good architect And if she had just focused on architecture, she would have been rather amazing. There she is. She looks like an architect, not an artist. Arp, of course, looks like a grumpy old guy. He also looks like an artist. I mean, you can see the difference. But he had a sense of humor, a wonderful sense of humor. So a lot of Arp's work appears almost like a pebble or a stone that you might find on the ground, and you pick it up and you work upon it. You work that stone. They're familiar and strange, both familiar and strange. And the relationship that you have with pieces like this that are sort of handed, scaled to the hand, is very intimate, like sitting with friends around a table. He had the soul of a poet, and he wrote a number of poems, and he actually felt that poetry was closer to what he was trying to express than his works of art were. If he wasn't an artist, he said he would become an art collector, and he eventually married one. So let me just conclude. This has been like a case study for me, and I know the third year would do a case study. They still do, I hope, something like that. And I may have had a number of preconceptions, but what emerged from this case study, went beyond any preconceptions I may have had. I was astounded at the work and the life of Jean and Sophie Tauber Arp, living in very difficult times. Jean even had to change his name, which was Hans, sometime after the war, to the French name Jean. So there are reasons that he had to do certain things. Imagine circumstances force you to change your first name. I mean, that's difficult. But these less than ideal circumstances, amidst that, they were able to consistently become lost in their work, collaborate with peers, and remain exceptionally productive. I think this is an important lesson, to get lost in the monastery of your work amidst the life that you are living. One of the torn paper collages. And this was one of his quotes: "It's not so easy." Like, you try, drop some paper on the floor, it's not so easy. So I'm leaving you with these 5 reminders. They're up. If there's time, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if you have any observations or comments that you want to make, I'd be welcome to entertain that. Anything that you might have? Anything that was confusing? Yes?
Thank you for your lecture. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the house and the city being mirrors of each other, or one being in the other, and also the function of a building being different than program, in the sense of architecture being art and function.
Okay, so let's go to the first one. You zeroed right in on it, huh? We're not in the habit of thinking analogically, right? So if I say, 1/2 is analogous to 4/8, right? Something like that. See, you make a proportion. So it involved 4 terms. And those things are not just, they just don't superficially resemble each other. They are, to use the same word, analogous. I know that's confusing. They have a fundamental relationship, almost like a family, right? They're in the same family. So I think the house and the city is in the same family. And it's not literal, because a city is a city and a house is a house. But if you start maybe to think imaginatively about it, or analogously, I just think analogies are just not, I wasn't taught about analogy any time in my formal education. It only came up when I started to teach here. So if you ask me a question, I can give you an example. Like if you're designing a table, I'll say, well, here's a table, see, that's a table. Well, that may not get you so far, right? Or you're designing a light fixture. Oh, that's an example. Examples have their place, but they're actually not, they don't rise to the level of knowledge. Analogy gets you in the game. Does that help a little bit? Maybe. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. It didn't make any sense to me. It didn't make any sense to me. But you go into a house, also a house means economy, if you go back to the root of the word. So the person running the house, I grew up in an old-fashioned house. My mother didn't work until I went through college. She was in charge of that economy, right? Called oikos, right? So there was a lot to it. So it's like a little city. And today, day doesn't go by. UPS, Amazon, stuff coming in, stuff going out, right? It's a tiny little city, but it's a house. So if you think analogously, it might open a window. The second question was about the difference between program and function.
Yes.
Well, they certainly are related. It seems like a program tries to group some functions together, right? So all the functions, I guess, might add up to a program, and that still wouldn't be enough to make architecture, right? So the function is more like an app. There's certain things you do in the kitchen. They're like micro functions, right? So apps, you can't do everything with certain apps. They're designed to function for certain situations, right? So I really see function as a kind of app, right? So what do you do? My phone, I have 40 apps on my phone. Well, what am I going to do with all those apps, right? So I think that's the connection that I see. But I think we like to think those two things are enough. If I just kind of, go in the library and do all my research about libraries, I'm designing a library, and then make a list of the rooms, I need to do all that and spend weeks and weeks on that. And maybe I could start with a detail. Maybe I could start with a window or a door or a column. And you'll circle back to those questions of program and function. Any other questions?
Frank, a little further.
Yeah.
Go from use to purposiveness.
Well, help me. Yeah. So use.
That's her question.
Yeah. So that's a nice distinction. Purposiveness, that already is, getting you up in the level of ideas, right?
You mentioned it.
Yeah, the stair is purpose, but the purpose of the stair is maybe after the lecture, although I know everyone needs to run, I might meet someone on the landing, right? And strike up a conversation. So there's a greater purposiveness, I think, that needs, as Hillary put it, to guide that thing we call program. Because the program without purposiveness is a little dead. It doesn't have enough legs, I would say. It doesn't give you enough momentum. So the purposeness of something, or what we call the final cause, or the final purpose, right, of things. What is the purpose of a pencil is for me to take notes, but I don't know. Does it have a final purpose? So that's a nice way to put it. She's helping me say what I was saying. That's what colleagues are supposed to do. Anything else? I hope it wasn't too confusing. There's a lot. Oh, who has a question? Yeah.
At a point in your lecture, you mentioned about building a few sizes too large or a few sizes too small. I understand the appeal of building too large because a lot of it is thickness with wall sections and extra space to work with. I'm more curious though about building a few sizes too small. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that if you're all working on the same project and you all make models at the same scale, I'm sure a lot of you are doing that. Maybe Friday, you're all going to show 1/4-inch models, and some are going to be like 2 feet long, and some are going to be like 6 inches long, right? So there's a range of interpretations of what that should be. I can tell you this room, for instance. I gave a talk here in September 1987. And I remember this slope being much steeper. I mean, I don't know how in 40 years or so, this slope, I feel like Hunter's sitting at my level. And the room is not as big as it was, so over time, things become almost 3/4 scale. Sometimes you have to make them a little too big, and they get smaller over time through familiarity. I don't know how Marcus feels about his house. It might get smaller. I don't know. It's probably not going to get bigger, you know. But I just wanted to lay the seeds of you thinking about that, because how do we decide the size of something and the scale of something? And I realize sometimes those are used as synonyms. It seems to me they have a slightly different meaning. Does that help a little bit? More than on the first question? Yeah. I sound like an eye doctor. Is this a little better? Is this a little better? Anything else? I know we stretched your patience. Oh. Okay, Andrew, I'll give you a quick answer. Yes.
This was going to take more than a quick answer, but maybe you can do it. If you can do it, I think, or if anybody can do it, you can probably do it. I've been questioning this notion of language, and you pointed out two things. You said architecture, or you spoke about architecture not being a language or speculating it's not a language, and then you quoted Steve about systems. But I thought, in teaching architecture, there's a question of literacy. Could you speak a little bit to this? Architecture is not a language?
Well, it's interesting. I'll try to make it quick because we're pushing our limits here. There's only one word that we have in the dictionary for what we do, right? Architecture. So linguistically speaking, we're rather limited. We're extremely limited. There are linguistic analogies I think we can make that are very useful, and in the 70s they were really important to lots of architects, Peter Eisenman and the whole group of the New York Five. There was this semantics going on. But and the other irony is, look at all the air that I tried to expend today, and how many words did I utter trying to tell you that architecture is not language. I think it's better to come down to a small set of words that are incredibly important for the architect. And of course we have our specific terminology: sill, saddle. Well, a horse has a saddle, but so does a door. And so most of our things are borrowed, but we have to respect the abiding silence of architecture too. And that's why I think it's worth thinking that architecture may not be a language, although we talk a lot about it. You're asking questions. For instance, you all could draw your questions, right? Probably a little harder, right? But that might be one way. In your notebooks, did anyone draw a question? We can talk more about that. But maybe I'll let you go because we pushed the limits.